I talked to a man. Do you know who William Irvin is?
No.
By any
Is
chance?
he
Okay,
a
so
novelist?
no, well, he's written a lot of books, a few bestsellers, but he writes about Stoicism. He just happened to, as Stoicism was kind of becoming popular again, he wrote about why Stoicism is a bulwark against a lot of life's troubles, and he relates it a lot to cognitive behavior therapy. I interviewed him recently, and so everything he said, this like brilliant guy, you'd think he could have written the intro to an LPP book or something like that, but we got to this point. He made this. He talked about how mind over matter kind of a thing. He said sometimes I go in this huge needle that the doctor has to put in me for this procedure, and he'll say this is going to hurt, and I'll say no, it's not, and then he'll do it. I'll be fine on my way. So we got to talking later, and I was talking about drugs and addiction, and I had the naive assumption that he was going to generalize the principle. And so I talked to him about drugs, and he just went on the tangent that talked about why both drugs are different. And I said, for my part, maybe I'll send you just this clip, but I said to him, it's funny, a guy like you, I would have thought you might say, just like when you go to the doctor and he says this is going to hurt and you say, no, it's not. I figured you for the type who, if someone says this drug's going to addict you, you might give people the benefit of the doubt to be able to say, no, it's not. And he had to double down on about how drugs are addictive. It really won't. It's a myth that won't die because it's created such a visual, a story. It's analogies for us. It's just so embedded in everything we do in our belief system that it would take a lot to reverse it.
It won't be. Although I will somewhere along in today's presentation or some slice of it. The earth shifted beneath our feet in terms of Wikipedia. Perhaps I'll get to that a little bit later then.
All right. So I'll let people hang in. Here's the first question. Do people get stuck in a developmental stage, i.e., this is in quotes, like somebody saying, I started drinking when I was 13, and so I was stuck. So I was stuck in that age until I became sober. What do you think?
Well, that's a standard. I mean, that's an AA, blueprint.
Yeah.
They'll say, oh, your development stopped at the age of 13 when you started drinking. I like the question. I like the fact that they're talking to us. We wrote a book, which is a developmental model of addiction, outgrowing addiction. I like that they're relating to that. But does anybody really believe that just because they started drinking, even if they drank problematically at 13, that they really didn't develop at all as a human? On the other hand, there are severe cases that you and I could point out where people stopped acquiring cultural assets. They didn't get a job, they didn't get married, they blocked themselves from certain kinds of achievements. I wouldn't say they stopped developing. I'd say they cut off options.
Yeah.
And so, okay, we're not totally in a different ballpark from that writer. But then the question always becomes, now what?
Yep.
Now what?
Yeah.
Okay, obviously, we can all look back with regret. All of us have missed opportunities, maybe substantial opportunities. And perhaps somebody who's been seriously addicted, if that's true, has missed some opportunities. So now the question becomes, now what? And, our answer is calm down. Your life isn't over. I know one thing, kind of a subspecialty of yours is working with people in Life Process Program on realizing their dreams, their purpose. An awful lot of people are not doing exactly what they want in life, and they want to do more of what they want in life. But the question becomes, okay, all bets are off, all sins are forgiven. I'm not the Pope, but, I'm not here to look at your past trauma and your past failures. Let's start from here. We don't want to and the most important thing you and I would say is we don't want to handicap you going forward with your regrets or your thinking, well, I was traumatized or I was addicted, and therefore I've missed out on all these opportunities. That's simply a way of concretizing, of reifying the problems you've already had. I do have a case study, though, I do want to throw in, though. I work with a woman who had this story. I mean, it's so unbelievable I have to tell this story because it seems implausible. She was semi-homeless. She came from an absent family when she was 13, and she hung around with a group of people who drank on the street. And she didn't like drinking. So when the bottle came around, she would pretend to drink from it and then not actually drink from it. But she went to AA anyhow. She married her husband, who was in AA. And she said, I got pregnant and I had a child. And now I live in an upper middle class suburb. And we get together in a mother's group and everybody drinks wine. And I'm sort of an alcoholic, except I've never actually had a drinking problem. She had a fit. She's an extreme example of somebody who had to fit into a category sort of to get by in life. And she didn't even have close. It's some people have a drinking problem when they're 13 or 18 or 24 and they outgrow the problem. She never actually drank. And she was an alcoholic. And now, you know, so that's an example of a life process program. And I say, well, why don't you help me figure this one out? You know, do you know whether you have a drinking problem? And her answer would be, well, I've never really drunk, but I don't think I have a drinking. I never had a drinking problem. So I said, why do you want to drink now? And, you know, she just wants to be a normal person with all these upper middle class women in this suburb, sip some wine. And I say she had become a fairly accomplished person. I said, do you think you could manage that? Or so, you know, our way forward wasn't too complicated. But as an extreme example of a person, this is the answer to the question, not whether she did develop as a human being. She wasn't homeless anymore. She didn't drink with a bunch of people on the street or not drink with a bunch of people on the street. She was stalled in the developmental stage of defining herself as an addict, which people often do. And what made this particularly ridiculous was that she was stalled in the stage of being an alcoholic when she never actually had drunk alcohol. So it's kind of reductio ad absurdum.
So in other words, you know, all of the things that got her from childhood to being an adult, that's development. You know, whatever she gained along the way is what she has to build on. And ironically, the thing that really bogged her down was that she believed that she must through osmosis or something have been an alcoholic. So really,
and we can recast the question from the person who wrote us.
Yeah.
Yes, the way you get stalled in being a teenager or whatever, young adult, and the worst way to be stalled is to be convinced that you're an addict when that's not true. Let's say you did drink and take drugs, unlike the woman I was describing. The fact that you're now defining yourself forever based on that's where we happen to be people who work with addiction. That's the worst example of non-working therapy, of a dysfunctional therapy. There's a word for that in medicine, iatrogenic, where the treatment causes the problem. And I know you happen to just do an interview with somebody, and they, for some reason, they focused on one thing that you and I often discuss, and we've discussed it in a podcast. She's in the news. It's Drew Barrymore, America's youngest addict, who started a winery and never talks about herself as an addict now. I mean, you know, she started out using cocaine and alcohol when she was 12 and 13 and declared herself an addict when she was 14. And she came from a very disabled household. You know, that's not a good MO for being introduced to alcohol and drugs. We're not recommending that. But to decide, as everybody in America did at that time, that she was America's youngest addict is bizarre and crazy for anybody who has the most casual awareness of development and how people are capable and in fact, naturally expand from that base. And especially somebody like Drew Barrymore, who's had a lot of options, a lot of talent, and is now a highly successful maker and shaker in Hollywood and the media.
But Carl, by the way, when I was listening to him on Joe Rogan, Joe was trying to convince him. Carl eventually just laughed it off and is kind of kind-hearted, but mocking kind of a way. But Joe Rogan was trying to convince Carl, there are some people who just can't, they just can't touch a drug. They can't look at a drug. They can't, because it'll just kill them. And he says, okay, I don't believe that. So, well, and he said, look, there's my friend Jim Norton, the comedian. He hasn't touched alcohol for 40 years or something like that, since he was 19, because it was so, and he was going, and Carl's like, well, wait a minute, when he was 19? He said, yeah. And he said, but he was a kid. I bet he was doing other dumb shit too.
That's funny, because Carl doesn't usually get into discussing addiction. That's not his bag. He's a laboratory guy. Yeah. And guys come in and they're taking a lot of meth. And he says, how about if I give you $10 not to use meth for a couple of days? Will you do it? And they say, okay.
Yeah.
And so he comes, he's not usually a life, although he looks at his own life, he's not usually a life guy. So Carl's now facing the problem that I've faced my whole career. All these people, and Carl's funny. His first book, High Price, Carl's a guy who came from the Miami ghetto and became the first tenured faculty member in the sciences at Columbia. People like that story. That's just, everybody's thinking, oh, God.
Yeah.
And then he'd come in and he'd tell that story, which is the first half of his book. And then he'd get into the second half of his book. And he interviewed, with very smart people. And then they have the Rogan reaction. Well, wait a second. Okay, you made it out of the ghetto. But that's not true. People are addicted for life. And that's why Carl wrote the second book, because now he's a drug user. And he wanted to say, okay, I'm going to forget that first half where I out of Miami ghetto. Let's talk about me, Carl Hart, now. Carl Hart, professor, who you're interviewing, who writes books, who's a successful drug user. And believe me, I'm not unusual. Just I'm the only one who's writing books about it.
Yep. All right. That's a pretty good question. Is sex addiction different from love addiction? Or at least sometimes can they be can those concepts be used interchangeably?
Well, I love these questions. We're getting a really sophisticated darn audience. I devote some time to that in Love and Addiction. First of all, there's something called Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. They throw them together. I liken love addiction to opioid addiction and sex addiction to cocaine or stimulant addiction. Love addiction, in my experience, tends to be people who cement themselves down in relationships that they should escape. For example, a woman comes in and says, my husband beats me. And then you go, if you're naive, you say, oh, have you thought of leaving them? And then she'll say, well, I love him and he loves me. And when he's not beating me, he expresses that love. So love addiction is more like, why are you in a relationship that extends for a long period of time when it's destructive? And sex addiction tends to be having multiple partners, quickly and rapidly interchanging them. So one seems more to parallel stimulant addiction and one more, an opioid, a narcotic, an narcoleptic kind of an addiction. So there is that big difference, I would say, if you wanted to divide them. But you can see those are loose categories. Who made that up? Conceivably, people do have a rapid and multiple love addictions. They go from one love affair to another, and they decide. Well, you and I were talking about Anna Farah. She's been married and divorced twice before she was 40. Her second marriage and divorce, she had a good divorce. She has a good relationship with her husband. The first marriage cost her about $1 million. If you have to pay $1 million to every ex-husband or spouse, pretty soon that can add up. She, went to college to be with one man who rejected her as soon as she got there. And then she left him for the man she married that she had. I mean, so she's a human being who's never been out of a defining love relationship. And of course, you think this is a very successful, very smart, very talented woman. Where's this coming from? And, you know, she describes the fact that her parents had gotten married in college, maybe when they were 19, and they drummed into her that you're only allowed to have sex with one person. That's not the way it's worked out for Anna Farah. What's her last name? I'm saying Anna. Do you know her last name? I'm getting her last name. Anna Faris.
It's Faris if it's not. Yeah, but now I can't remember which one's the real one. Whatever.
And so she's somebody, and you might say, well, the sex, it's not exactly like she's a sex addict, but sex seems to be a part and parcel of her forming a relationship. So as soon as she left her second divorced husband, that same month, she became involved and became engaged to another person. It would seem that a thoughtful person, she does an advice column called Unqualified and write a book that's very introspective. Somebody might say to her, do you want to think through exactly how you form permanent relationships, which haven't so far been close to permanent, and we're not putting you down. But are you maybe conceptualizing love in a way that's not helpful and accurate for you?
No. This is I thought this might be a nice pairing. It's not the order that I received the questions, but I gave you a heads up on this. Someone wanted to know, the reason the person wanted to know this is because the man I'm about to mention, he had read his work for a long time and felt kind of indoctrinated by it almost, and has since kicked those beliefs. But he was interested in him for a while, and then after becoming acquainted with you and your work, had to wonder, do you know Patrick Carnes?
We're going to talk perhaps at some point about Wikipedia. Wikipedia description to me is very insightful. It begins by saying Stanton Peele views addiction as an extension of normal behavior that most people experience in one form or another, and that most people who experience it even in severe forms outgrow. That's maybe the first paragraph. The second paragraph is, Peele wrote Love and Addiction in 1975, more than a decade before the cascade of books like Carnes books, you know, the Shadows books about sex addiction. So for some reason, Stanton Peele didn't use the term codependence, but his view of relationships as having addictive potential precedes by a decade or more the most popular books and the people that are most known for that, like Codependent No More by Melanie Beattie. And bless Maya Salovitz in her book. She writes about how love and addiction kind of changed her view of addiction. She's not as old as me, but she's not young. And, you know, looking at love relationships, which were very much entangled with her heroin and cocaine addiction, made sense to her and was very helpful to her. And there are people I know, prominent people who know that I wrote Love and Addiction because they read Maya Salovitz's bestseller, how many, 30 or 40 years after I wrote Love and Addiction. Yeah. So, and there's a story in my memoir, I'm talking out of school now. I've had some unusual experiences in my memoir, some of which are inexplicable to me. One night I was giving a lecture, a workshop in Colorado Springs, and I had a great room with a panoramic view. We used to stay at the Antlers Hotel, and there was a knock at my door, and an attractive woman. This isn't a sex story. Don't get me wrong. The woman said, "Oh, I wanted to make your acquaintance. Maybe we could go out and have a cup of coffee and walk around Colorado Springs." And it was Patrick Carnes' fiance. He was getting divorced and he was dealing with some marital issues. And she said, "Well, I'm free for the evening. I just wanted to meet you." And, we discussed our lives and walked around town. I've never met, talked, or corresponded with that woman ever again. I've never met, talked, or corresponded with Patrick Carnes in any way, shape, or form. So one night of my life, I was attached to Patrick Carnes' life. But the answer to the question, if I know him or have met him, the answer is no.
What do you think of his work? That's my
Oh,
question.
you know, I mean, what it says in Wikipedia, the Wikipedia entry about me, I love Wikipedia. I donate $2.50 a month to them. They say it must have Stanton Peele, who used love and addiction as a way of explaining that addiction is not a disease, because most people have experienced, you know, destructive love relationships or compulsive love relationships. And therefore, that's a bridge, a segue to being able to understand drug addictions. Must have been shocked and depressed when, instead of that happening, they incorporated love and sex addiction into the 12-step model, which is exactly, doesn't say this in Wikipedia, ass backwards, exactly the wrong way to go.
Yeah.
And that's true. It's you know, it's like people saying, oh, look at this. Most people recover from addiction on their own. I wonder how we're going to fit that into the disease model, which is what Dora Volko, the head of the NIDA, is basically trying to do now. Right. Instead of, you know, people have this concept of a paradigm shift. That's the most famous science, you know, Thomas Kuhn's idea of, you know, how normal science changes. I haven't experienced that with addiction. As you and I, really, that's the theme of what we're talking about. People assimilate all kinds of discrepant information in their own lives and other people's lives about addiction into the same model that information disproves. Well, look, if you realize that most people outgrow addiction, or that most people take opioids without becoming addicted, or that heroin addiction or whatever drug addiction really isn't that dissimilar from the kinds of relationships people form with other kinds of entanglements, doesn't that cause you to think about it in a different way? And the answer tends to be, well, no, I can't change my way of thinking. It's like, you know, you and I probably know more progressive audiences than non-progressive audiences, and people sneer at Trumpians who say, oh, the election was stolen. And then people go, well, wait a second. They went into court, and every time they went into court, the judges, even when they were Trump judges, said, well, you don't have any evidence that the election was stolen. The evidence is all in the opposite direction. They still believe it. How everybody sneers. Look at those people. How
could
they
you
can't
still
change their mind
that?
based on the evidence. For better or worse, they're pretty much exactly the same.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask this. So I wanted to at some point discuss the article about the New York Times, the alcoholic babysitter, but maybe we put that on the back burner for now.
Why don't you start with that? Why don't you talk about your reactions to it?
Okay, and then there's one more question after that. I don't really know what to think about it. It was just kind of an oddball piece to me.
Why don't you describe what the woman says for starters?
Yeah. So it's a woman who's talking about that she's hired a babysitter who claims she has been an alcoholic in her life, but she claims that she's 9 days sober. And so the woman is doing this internal dialogue about, all right, on one hand, I know all addicts and alcoholics lie. So who knows if that's even the real time frame. And then again, how long should be acceptable? 9 days, 60 days, 90 days? And it's hard to tell whether she's saying like which direction she's going with that. But then she says, well, then again, if I look back to AA, it should say that AA would say that she needs to be working because, you know, doing work, keeping busy is like a bulwark. Which, okay, good for you, AA, for getting that piece right.
Would you hire a recovering alcoholic to babysit for your child?
Well, here's the thing. This is what the piece all comes down to. I think she's trying to say it's sort of like a help me out with the word here. She wants a cookie, is what I'm saying. She's trying to say, well, if I weren't an alcoholic who knew so much about AA, I mean, would I have hired this poor soul? And so I certainly wouldn't hire a babysitter for my child on the sole basis that she was an alcoholic or that she wasn't, you know.
You would hire a babysitter by evaluating you have certain criteria that you hire a babysitter. Does this person seem like a stable, reasonable human being?
Right.
Do I feel my baby will be safe in
Right.
this person's hands? And I would include in that the likelihood that they don't get a bottle of vodka out of your refrigerator and start drinking. That would be a minimum requirement. And so, you know, you make an assessment of a human being along those lines. And, you know, we could ask the same question. Should I become involved with somebody who had an alcohol or a drug problem? And, you know, I'd say, well, what are they like? So I'd say, you know, I'd say, well, it's what you're saying. Nothing's going to short circuit your evaluation of a human being, or short circuit the process by which you decide a human being is worthwhile or not.
Put it this way: if you said to somebody, "Do you trust Stanton with your kids?" They wouldn't. No one really practically is going. This is why I said the piece is bizarre. No one's going to start by saying, "Well, let's see. He has had drinks, and he's had 9 days. But what is it? 9 days? 60 days? 100 days?" No one does that Socratic dialogue. They say yes or no, and here's the reason why.
So let me give two cases that go in opposite directions. Having said that,
Okay.
I worked for a man who had a long history of drug addiction type problems. And one person who resented him quite a lot was his sister. And now his sister has 2 small children. And when I do forensic cases, you know, where people are in court and somebody's saying, well, you know, are they, you know, to be trusted? He had his own children and there were custody issues. And so one person I talked to said, I'm really, really impressed with how well this man deals with his own 2 children. And he gave examples. He never gets upset with them. One time we were at a Super Bowl party, both the kids were there, and they both started really goofing around and misbehaving. And he never lost his cool. You know, he got them involved. Another thing he said was his one kid is a math whiz and the other kid has math problems, and he deals with them both exactly appropriate. You know, the math whiz, the guy I know is the guy I was working with is a tech guy, and he, you know, gives them all kinds of advanced tektronix. And the other one who's not good, he respects her self-esteem. He's very patient with her. You know, he goes over at her own pace. So the question isn't, did this guy used to abuse amphetamines? The question is, how does he deal with his kids? But the thing that for me nailed the coffin of this guy can't be relied on, his sister, who was many years younger than him, who deeply resented him, allowed him to babysit her own children, and they would spend weekends with them. And then I said, you're okay with that? And she said, I don't give it a hair's breadth thought. And so I go to the court, this is a woman who's not, you know, coming in saying, you know, whatever this guy does is good for me. She's really nailed him to the cross in the past. She has complete faith in him now. That's pretty good evidence that the person's reliable. Having said that, if somebody came to me and said, oh, you know, I've just started a relationship with a recovering person, would you advise me to be wary of that in any way? I'd say I would tell them I'd have my guard up.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say I'd be, not because I'm worried that they're going to start drinking. In our case, you and I know the answer to this, because you and I would think we're more suspicious of people in recovery than we are people who may have some kinds of issues, because they subscribe to a whole higher power philosophy that we have a hard time with. And is that somebody you want to be involved with? You know, check it out. You know, I'm not saying yes or no, but, you know, well, I'm going to confess to a prejudice here. I hope this doesn't disqualify me. I would never be involved personally with a recovered person. That's just not going to work for me.
By which you mean someone who who does recovery kind of programming and
Right. If they're in AAA, I could never be involved with somebody who didn't drink. God bless you, Zach. I couldn't do that. And my wife and I had sort of similar attitudes towards alcohol and drugs. We raised 3 children. I think we discussed this last week, none of whom is an alcohol or a drug addicted person, all of whom are achievement oriented. Here, I'll tell you another. I didn't tell this story the last time. I have a million favorite stories about my ex-wife. When Anna, they put you in the DARE program in elementary school. And when Anna went to the DARE program, the cop said, look to your left and to your right. One of the 3 of you is going to be dead from drugs or alcohol by the time you become an adult. And when my wife heard that, my ex-wife heard that, she pulled Anna from the DARE program. I'm sure she was the only person in the school district who did that. And Mary called them up and said, I don't want my daughter hearing that kind of crap. Who made that statistic up? And so Anna told us that she had to sit out in the hallway when they did their program, and she missed the party at the end of the semester for the kids. So some years later, I said, Anna, did you really sit out in the hallway and miss the party? And she said, no, Dad. I mean, I knew that what they were telling us was bullshit. But, of course I wasn't going to sit out in the hallway and miss the party. I went and like all the other kids, I listened to what they had, all that crap they had to say. And then I went to the party. I don't know that I ever told my ex-wife that, because I thought that was, realistic coping.
We should invite Mary on. It could be like a Jerry Springer thing. She's hearing for the first time this lie.
Right. She was well prepared for it.
Yeah.
But let's put it this way. I don't know. When people get married, maybe they check out, well, do we have the same attitude towards money? Do we have the same attitude towards having a family? Which is, me and my wife did have that. Do we have the same political attitudes? Yes, we did. So that worked. And we had the same attitudes towards substances, that they weren't all consuming, that they were a part of life, that your basic life was your basic life, and that determined how you use substances rather than the other way around. Yeah. Neither of us were drug or alcohol demonizers. And I think I knew that when I met her. I mean, I guess I didn't have a list and said, well, here's what we agree on, here's what we don't agree on. But I could never, anybody who knows me would know, I could never, ever, how could I be at peace being intimate with a person who, was in AA and believed in a higher power? And in fact, we should move on. I would have a line I would give to some people I knew. I would say, I wonder sometimes about your drinking. I think you should be aware of it and mindful of it. It doesn't bother me. But if you get to a point where you decide you've gone too far and you're going to quit entirely and join AA, you and I are through. So just keep that in mind in terms of how you drink now.
Fair enough.
Because if we get to that point, we're not going to be friends anymore.
Well, how about this question then? Let's do one more question and then let's take an intermission. Given what you just said, you'll love this. And I know you love the way that these kinds of questions are phrased. Aren't there... one last thing. I'll be honest. This wasn't I solicited. I didn't say, hey, anyone have any questions on this one? And then they send it back. This is something I snapshotted from another group that I was in. So aren't there some substances that some people should stay away from more than others? Like, I get some people do coke or whatever, and that they don't make it a lifestyle. But for some people, they've left everything in their life behind for it, and it ruined their lives over it. In my case, it was alcohol, though.
Well, there's 2 different questions there. One question is, are there some substances that you personally have trouble with? And And are there some
Right.
substances which every human being has trouble with that nobody should use?
Good
And
point,
our
yeah.
answer to the second one, going back to Carl Hart, is no. The answer to the first question, I'll tell another story out of my memoir. Nobody will be able to have to buy my memoir. Have I ever told this story? I had baby teeth. I had 3 baby teeth that progressed into my adulthood. They didn't develop. And so I had to go to a very expensive oral surgeon to get, a tooth implant done well in New York City. It cost a few bucks. And when I went into the guy, he was extremely smart. He seemed to be interested in engaging me in conversation. And this was the conversation we had. His son had been involved with heroin. He sent him to Florida to Rehab Alley. He got out of rehab and he was living in a halfway house, and he smoked marijuana now and drank alcohol. And the rehab people told him, well, he's not in recovery. It's no good. You can't let him home. Obviously, the fact that the guy brought this up to me indicated that he was saying, is that really true? And my brief answer to him was, some people can deal with all kinds of drugs. Some people can deal with heroin. And some people who can not deal with heroin can deal with marijuana and alcohol. And you and I know that's called harm reduction. When people switch from heroin to marijuana, some people that works better for. And I said, this is another example of themes that you and I always emphasize, and we've been talking about them this time. If you allow him home, you have to insist on certain standards around the house. He has to go to work or go to school or whatever's on his menu, and he can't disturb your home. And those are your criteria. You're going to have to obviously, if you just spent $125,000 in Florida and he's causing some family problems, he's going to understand that he's a little bit under the gun. And so, the end of the story was, when I came back to replace my other baby tooth, the guy said to me, your input saved my family. And so when I got home, I wrote him a letter and I said, $7,500 to replace a tooth after I saved your family. He actually wrote me a whole letter.
I was wondering.
And the letter he wrote was, Stanton, I'm not used to paying people for professional services when they're sitting in my dentist chair for a half an hour. However, you may not be aware, but dental implants are very expensive, and I gave you a professional discount. So, you saved a couple $100, and I'm going to do the same thing for this baby tooth. And then I brought Anna in because she had her wisdom teeth pulled, and his assistant said, oh, the doctor's giving you a professional discount. So at that point, I figured, we're okay.